afternoon, everybody. So I'm Richard Clay. I'm a professor of digital humanities, but actually at heart, I'm an art historian. And I think that's why I was asked to moderate this afternoon's panel, which is called The Art of Using Art. Thanks so much for staying on. My panel, which is quite extraordinary, and I'll introduce them in a minute, have the rather unenviable task of following Terminator and Asimov. But we do have a few aces up our sleeves. So for a start, the last panel did take a longue durée view of history, but we think we're the first panel that goes from the ancient Romans to today. So we're going to do really broad. We also think that this is the best looking panel. Oh, no, actually, I meant the best looking PowerPoints. Sorry, chaps. So we think we can keep you entertained. We hope we'll be thought-provoking. And we're very keen to get you involved in the dialogue. So once the presentations are over, it's going to be straight over to you. So start queuing the questions up. So the panel is, to my left, David Welch, Kent University. David is Emeritus Professor of Modern History and the Director of the Centre for the Study of War, Propaganda, yes, the P word, and Society at the University of Kent. Now, David, as well as having written extensively on the topic of propaganda, especially in modern and contemporary periods, is also a curator. And he curated, 4 years ago, a very successful show at the British Library that was exploring propaganda and persuasion. So it's a very relevant, very StratCom-y topic, it seems to me. He's currently working on another project, which is again curatorial, and it's with the Verdi Museum in LA and the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and that's on the psychological landscape of the Cold War. To David's left is Andris Teikmanis, and he's the Professor of Visual Semiotics at the Art Academy in Latvia, where he also serves as the Vice-Rector, as well as having a host of other roles. I kind of wonder with Andris how on earth he has time to do all of these things, but he nevertheless does sit on the Higher Education Council in Latvia. The chairman of the Latvian Council of Culture of Arts is one of his roles, but he's also the chairman of the Latvian Council of Visual Arts, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. And his work focuses on the ways in which art influences social development. And he too has a curatorial string to his bow. And I think that's really interesting because art exhibitions, we might think they have small audiences, but they influence influencers. And that might be a theme that emerges today. Last and most definitely not least is Sam Viviano. And Sam is a legend in the world of caricaturists. He's an American caricaturist who since 1999 has served as the art director of the iconic Mad magazine, which if you're not familiar with it, your life is about to be enriched. His striking images have appeared on the cover of all kinds of other publications, from Institutional Investor, he's been in Reader's Digest, Rolling Stone, you name it, he's done it. Sam lectures widely, and in 2014, his impressive career to date was formally recognized when he was inducted into the Media Industry News Design Hall of Fame. So, it's my understanding that what is about to follow will, among other things, involve hearing about the ways in which art has been mobilized in what we might nowadays call influencing campaigns over the centuries. And that we may well hear about how mobilizing art in such ways occasionally backfires in unexpected ways and occasionally succeeds in unexpected ways. I suspect we'll hear a little bit about curating exhibitions and the pros and the cons and the risks and the influence. And importantly, we're going to be hearing from a preeminent practitioner, an actual live artist. I only ever get to study the dead ones. It's really good because they can't answer back. And he is going to be talking to us about the art of influence, although he's very modest about the extent of the influence his art might have. So that's enough by way of an introduction. I'm going to hand over to these outstanding speakers and their delicious PowerPoints.
Well, as you probably gathered from the tone of the introduction from the chairman, we consider ourselves as very much the light relief of the conference. I've been invited to, and I'm delighted to be here, by the way, I've been invited to look at the relationship between art and propaganda. I have to say that, you know, when I'm looking at art, although the timescale is actually quite extended, I'm actually confining myself to two specific examples. So there's a whole range of areas that I'm not looking at in terms of art and propaganda, and that includes film, music, etc. So having been invited to look at the relationship between art and propaganda, I want to start by saying that, you know, writing in the 1940s, it was George Orwell who famously claimed in his book of the same name that, and I quote, "all art is propaganda." Orwell attempted to show how detailed analysis of a work or body of work gives rise to trenchant and aesthetic and philosophical commentary. But because of the pejorative associations attached to the term propaganda, artists and the art world are generally ashamed to be associated with propaganda. Often, when we think of art as propaganda, we invariably associate it with totalitarian regimes or times of conflict. Let me offer you a quote from Pablo Picasso. He said, and this is in relation to art commissioned by the state. Can art, he was addressing this question, can it ever be any good? And he said, and I quote, "Art is something subversive to be used against the established state. If art is ever given the keys to the city, it will be because it has been so watered down, rendered so impotent, that it's not worth fighting for." Yet we know that propaganda has been around for millennia. A much ancient art that we value today is, I would argue, a form of propaganda. The Parthenon marbles extol the virtues of the Athenians at the expense of their enemies, promoting the political values of a Greek city-state. These sculptures are, in a sense, the definition of art, in Picasso's words, given the keys to the city. And yet few people would describe them as impotent. Another example of a piece of art from the ancient world is Trajan's Column in Rome. Dedicated in AD 113, it was built to commemorate two successful campaigns that the Emperor Trajan waged against the Dacians, a barbarian tribe from modern-day Romania. It was constructed from 20 different blocks of marble weighing up to 77 tons each, and it contained 2,500 figures, which were once brightly painted. It's a panoply of activity and detail. Trajan, for example, himself makes an appearance no less than 59 times. The frieze is a potent expression of Roman efficiency and military ruthlessness, but it's also a masterpiece of narrative art. Another example would be the Bayeux Tapestry, depicting the Norman conquest of England in 1066. It could also be cited as an example where powerful visual imagery has been used to convey a persuasive image. In this case, of course, an historic military victory from the perspective of the victors. And of course, the list goes on. So we only have to look at history to understand that art has been used to symbolize and reinforce the power of political rulers. During the Cold War, for instance, art became a weapon deployed by the American government. In 1946, the US State Department embarked on an innovative program of what was then called cultural diplomacy, described at the time, and I quote, as a cultural Marshall Plan. At the heart of this initiative was a project known as Advancing American Art. And the program called for the acquisition by the State Department of modernist paintings by contemporary American artists with the intention that the art should travel through Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Asia, what the State Department referred to as the ideological battlegrounds. Its objective was to exemplify the freedom of expression enjoyed by artists in a democracy while demonstrating America's artistic coming of age. The British Council had been undertaking such sort of campaigns for many, many years. But of course, this audience here today is primarily concerned with the importance of art in strategic communications. And so in this context, I want to focus on two aspects, two factors, which to me spring immediately to mind. First of all, the intention of both artists and possibly those who have commissioned the work, and secondly, the effectiveness, or otherwise, of the art itself. What is the purpose of art? Whether it be a monument, building, sculpture, painting, etc. I want to look briefly at two examples that illustrate both the significance and the limitations of the role of art as a form of strategic communications. And by strategic communications, I'm using a very crude definition of the best message through the right channel. So let me start by taking the example that everybody will be familiar with, and that, of course, is Picasso's Guernica. For it highlights, it seems to me, some of the dangers in attempting to gauge the political impact of a piece of art, and also, arguably, the limitations of analysing art in terms of strategic communications. The work itself, or not this work in fact, but was commissioned in January 1937 by the Republican government to create a large mural at the Spanish Pavilion at the Paris International Exhibition. Picasso, who was living in Paris at that time, had been reading eyewitness accounts of the bombing in April 1937 of the Basque town of Guernica by German and Italian bombers, arguably the first example of blitzkrieg in total war. And so he abandoned his initial commission, and the result, of course, is Guernica, his reaction to the destruction. It has subsequently become one of the most famous paintings to capture the horror of modern warfare, a universal and powerful symbol warning humanity against the suffering and devastation of war. On the 75th anniversary of the painting's creation, the writer Alejandro Escalona wrote, and I quote, "Guernica is to painting what Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is to music, a cultural icon that speaks to mankind, not only against war, but also of hope and peace. It is a reference when speaking about genocide from El Salvador to Bosnia," end of quote. But what of the reaction at the time to this piece of work? Did it have a contemporary impact in the way that it elicits emotions and reactions today? Well, when Guernica was initially exhibited in July 1937 at the Paris exhibition, it received mixed reviews. Some critics in Spain and also outside objected to the mural's modernist style, while those to the left of the Republican government, the Marxists, criticized Guernica as lacking in political commitment and faulted it for not offering a vision, a better vision of the future. But really, when you're looking at the context itself, the painting was largely overshadowed by the monumental sculptures and pavilions of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that were blatantly used for competitive propaganda effect. And that's a postcard of the exhibition, and you can see the two competing buildings there. The 1937 exhibition was dominated, in fact, by these structures, huge and deliberately symbolic, which confronted each other, pitting fascist ideology against communism. Now, following Franco's victory in Spain, the painting was then sent to the United States to raise funds in support of Spanish refugees. And there it remained at the Museum of Modern Art until 1981, when, and of course only after Franco's death in 1975, it was ceded back to Spain. During the Vietnam War, the room containing Guernica became a site of occasional anti-war vigils. But interestingly enough, Picasso's mural, a copy of which was purchased by the UN as a tapestry, is now almost inescapably linked to the US-led war in Iraq. In February 2003, Colin Powell spoke about going to war in Iraq at the United Nations Security Council. There was a press conference scheduled afterwards. The tapestry reproduction of Guernica, located outside the entrance of the council room, was covered with a blue curtain. UN officials claimed that the mural was a distracting background for the TV cameras covering the press conference. Its unappealing menage of mutilated bodies and distorted faces proved too strong a counter-message when articulating to the world why the US was going to war in Iraq. Guernica, in other words, became an inconvenient masterpiece. So, visual imagery has long been used to convey a persuasive message. Let me just return briefly to the Picasso quote. If art is ever given the keys to the city, it will be because it has been so watered down, rendered so impotent, that it's not worth fighting for. And let me now juxtapose Picasso's Guernica with the work of Petr Pavlensky, the Russian performance artist and political activist. Pavlensky founded the independent online newspaper Political Propaganda in 2012, and it's dedicated to contemporary art in political contexts. If you're not familiar with Pavlensky's work, he's most famous for his, in quotes, protest art, usually involving himself in stage happenings, constructed not for an art gallery, but for the conventional and more specifically for the social media via his videos that he takes of these so-called, in quotes, performances. Pavlensky first became known for sewing his mouth shut in political protests against the incarceration of members of the Russian punk group Pussy Riot in July 2012. He talked about this, and he explained this as he was highlighting, and I'm quoting here, the lack of regard for artists in contemporary Russia. Then, a year later, for entwining barbed wire around his nude body whilst lying before the Legislative Assembly in St. Petersburg. And later in the same year, in November, he nailed his scrotum to the Red Square in front of the Kremlin. His action, captured on video, and I can tell you it's not for the light-hearted, especially for the men, was made specifically for social media and titled Fixation. And the performance, in inverted commas, was timed to coincide with Russia's annual police day. And according to the artist, and I'm quoting here, it was a metaphor for the apathy, political indifference, and fatalism of modern Russian society. And to give you one more example, in October 2014, Pavlensky cut off his earlobe while sitting naked on the roof of the infamous Serbsky Center to protest against the political abuse of psychiatry for political dissidents in Russia. So here we have an artist, or if you like, a propagandist, who literally suffers for his art. Now, these events were largely suppressed within the Russian mainstream media, but they attracted widespread international attention because of the speed with which the visual images are disseminated via social media outlets. They were also reported on conventional media, such as Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who of course are only too keen to showcase examples of dissent within the Russian regime. So to bring this to conclusion then, so we have here two different artistic experiences, both making political statements through their art, both radical in their approach to artistic conventions of the time, both aimed to shock the audience. One artist was already internationally acclaimed, the other is largely unknown. But what of the role of art in terms of strategic communications? Remember, the best message through the right channels. What I'm suggesting here is that employing art as a form of strategic communications is fraught with dangers. For example, if we go back to the advancing American art in 1946-47, it was intended to travel for 5 years, it was funded for 5 years, and it did meet with some initial success in Prague, Czechoslovakia. But then word of the artists that were actually used by the Americans got back to America itself. It was debated in Congress and denounced widely within the US as being un-American, and funding was withdrawn. Returning to the Picasso painting, Guernica, this reflects a form of art that can take years to have an impact. Those monuments that I referred to, those monumental monuments in the Paris exhibition, as propaganda exercises to impress, were eventually torn down. Whereas Guernica remains, its impact largely dependent on the interaction between an audience and the sheer size of the canvas, and its message is really within the confined space of an art gallery. Pawlenski's work, on the other hand, is very different. It's instantaneous, and it is, if you like, disposable. Its immediate global scope, as opposed to Guernica, almost transcends the performance itself. Now, whether it will endure and whether such art can be effectively used as a means of strategic communication is open to question. But at least I hope I've raised a number of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andris. Well, it certainly brings a new meaning to the artist having to be willing to suffer for their art.
Ladies and gentlemen, and first, it's my absolute pleasure and honor to be here. I would like to express our thanks to Riga Strategical Communications Center, StratCom Center of Excellence Riga, and I think it's an absolutely amazing experience for me and for our institution, Art Academy of Latvia, to work together in order to create and provide this panel inside conference where we are intending to discuss, speak, and find some solutions concerning such issues like strategic communication. Art, as we know, for centuries, or probably better to say for thousands of years, is being used like a tool of propaganda, like an instrument of establishing ideological ideas, like a signs of power, and probably if we also, bearing in mind our strategic position, was weaponized, used in such kind, like to promote some ideas behind armed conflicts. And the first known example is the standard of Ur, and nevertheless that historians are not came to conclusion about exact function of this artwork. It's also one of the first examples of how war is depicted in some sense of victorious graciousness, and you see this visual narrative that's coming from down to up, and these enemies are crushed, and yeah, and we see it. Visual power of art to provide you with images probably better and more stronger than words. However, nowadays, role of art as strategic communication is going largely unnoticed. While it's generally acknowledged that strategic communication is dealing with constructed and distributed realities, then contemporary art practices is rarely addressed in such sense. Strategic communication is more associated with mass media, media design, visual communication, social networks, new technologies, techniques of persuasion, and so on and so on. However, art is rarely being addressed in such sense. And the reason is dual, mainly because we could say that contemporary art as such is dual. It's very ambivalent in nowadays. Firstly, the contemporary art is highly critical and providing some kind of critical discourse toward any kind of dominance, power hierarchies, violence. Contemporary art is mainly based on theories of post-structuralism, feminism, post-feminism, neo-Marxism of all kinds, and post-colonialism, and is concerned with outcomes of globalization and providing some kind of human aspects of issues of migration and refugees. So it's providing some kind of very highly critical discourses that's so hard to use in some kind of narrow way of strategic communication. However, second aspect of contemporary art is on the opposite side quite different. Contemporary art is global and international. And probably contemporary art nowadays is the only international language widely used around the globe. And it's some kind of global dissemination. We could say contemporary art represents, while it's easy to say that contemporary art rather represents point of view of so-called critical geopolitics. In the same time, the distribution of contemporary art remain our classical geopolitical flashpoints. It's because of roots of contemporary art in order to explain in some sentences to such honorable auditory what the contemporary art is. We should acknowledge that contemporary art is something that's born out of modern art. Modern art born at the end of 19th century like a critical response toward modernity, toward some kind of industrialization, militarization, and colonialism and imperialism of European powers. But in the same time, modern art was absolutely Eurocentric, and it was globally distributed along with power lines of European powers, and born in Paris, it's distributed almost in accordance with Eurocentric powers around the globe. And nevertheless, that modern art was predecessor, and contemporary art put themselves like in contrary, like a critical discourse toward modern art in the second half of 20th century. Both these aspects of modern art, being Eurocentric and being globally distributed, remains important for contemporary art. If we speak about historical heritage of modern arts even more, a radical political position of modern arts giving some kind of possibility to reshape itself into so-called avant-garde art of the beginning of 20th century. And the avant-garde art became hotbed for probably one of the most politically elaborated theory toward how art could be used, so-called socialistic realism. If I look at the global distribution of socialistic realism, some countries were included, some countries were excluded. We clearly see this part of Cold War that was devoted to Soviet Union, and in the same time this global geopolitical position, and probably also even in American continents. Soviet Union collapsed and socialistic realism disappeared. In the same time, global aspirations and total pretensions of contemporary art emerged from the heritage of violet utopias of modernity and avant-garde. And while the contemporary art positions themselves as critical response, it remains globally engaged and provides universal art models worldwide. There is no better proof of this global engagement as worldwide distribution of recurring art events that are known like biennales, triennales, quadriennales, or quinquennales. However, the geospatial allocation is absolutely not random. It represents historical heritage points and also point out the next flashpoints in accordance with classical geopolitics. If we just look at the top 20 biennales of contemporary art, how they are distributed around the world, yes, we know there's about 200 biennales nowadays, some of them rather small ones that nobody knows. But these top 20 perfectly show where is the ambitions, where is the next intentions, and where is the rising nations, and where is the probably rising flashpoints of tensions could be. In such sense, there's also one absolutely controversial case of Riga or so-called Riga International Biennale of Contemporary Art. It's proposed that it will be held in Latvia in 2018. It will be time of centenary celebration of Latvian state. But in the same time, this biennale is surrounded by some kind of controversy because there's actually not known funds that are going to be provided for this biennale. There is no clear how these relations with local art scene would be established. Sometimes these recurring art events create some local controversies. This year, such controversy was in Greece, where Documentas at this ordinary Newcastle also had some kind of parallel exhibition in Greece, and many of local people saw it's like some kind of cultural imperialism, cultural neocolonialism that's coming from Germany. You know this very tension feelings, particularly in the left-wing leaning intellectuals. So also, if we could speak about this Riga International Biennale, we should point out when there was quite hard and hot discussion with organizers. One of the answers they provided why they chose Riga last summer was that, and first it was a historical part, very important historical point, and also, as I mentioned, Baltic Gateway. Looking from such point, the reason to choose contemporary art as an instrument of strategic communication lies only not in its worldwide dissemination. While contemporary art produces, constructs, and distributes something like we could call it simulated reality or simulacra, like Jean Baudrillard named it, or if I look from the point of view of Jacques Rancière, we are living in the time of aesthetic regime of art. In the same time, this dominance and deconstruction of power and hierarchical structures that is contemporary art intended to do provide best opportunities for society to critically attend any kind of information and critically select, analyze information, and not only information that are going to be around us, that are going we are going to be fed up by mass communications or social networks or some kind of shadow operators, as we heard before, but also critically analyze and critically look at the proposed models of future, because if we look from the point of the importance of humankind, art could elaborate and provide society with future scenarios. It was sometimes it was something mentioned some time ago by Yuri Lotman, that the main function of art is provide society with possible future scenarios. And in such sense, contemporary art could serve not only to provide with some future scenarios, but provide this possibility critically analyze these future scenarios. In such sense, just a few examples from the outcomes of the workshops that was held during conference Art Future, Future States at Art Academy in 2016. We started with some matrix of scenarios for visual art itself. It was elaborated for the necessity of creating visual art strategy by Visual Art Council, that is Consultative Council of Ministry of Culture. But as a result, no of these 4 possible scenarios was being chosen, but there was some kind of general model of strategy was elaborated. But these scenarios were intact and were critically addressed by this attendance of workshop. And they also decided to dismount these vectors of uncertainties, critical uncertainties, international and national vectors, because looking from this point of view that contemporary art is global, it's not probably so important. But some other, like a technology and epistemology, that could be viewed as some kind of contrast or was introduced. And also individual and state, because it was just Trump won elections in the United States, and their mood of feeling and the way how people think the word state just changed. So we finished it with 8 possible scenarios, and like in the technologically developed world, or in the world where the technologies could be just not so developed or failed. Another kind of critical analysis of future scenarios we are usually trying to deal, as also during these 2 previous days, we are trying to deal in technological aspects with possibly positive scenarios and outcomes. And on the one hand, it could be some kind of external expansion of our civilization, like it was predicted by Hawking, we could go to space, or in other way, some probably internal development of our civilization, like we heard in the previous panel, elaboration of AI and all these eventualities that could possibly bring out of these results. But if we look from this point of view, if you use means of contemporary art, you also develop some kind of negative scenarios in the same time, and this disaster or some kind of cosmic catastrophe or pessimistic scenario, just the world left, could be left in oblivion, and some kind of anti-technological revolution and homeostasis that could be achieved, and trying to not to harm world while we're living, and some dystopian scenarios possible. The same tools were also applied to local problem, to Latvian state, and some kind of super Latvia or hyper Latvia was elaborated using this visual logic model of hypercub that could be used to analyze different scenarios, and 16 different possible scenarios were elaborated. I will not go to deep analysis of each of them, of course, but to just provide. And this difference between just future studies and using forecasting scenarios in future studies and this exercise, contemporary art exercise, this first difference was because of use of aesthetic tools to achieve some kind of cognitive aims. Just example of this trying to promote contemporary art as some kind of tool of possible strategic communication. And we should remember that contemporary art, if we compare with modern art itself, is not only visually grounded. Critical discourse and textual exercises also play absolutely significant role forming contemporary artistic expressions. And even more, we could speak not only about contemporary art, but also about contemporary design in such sense, because also nowadays we are widely using such term like a critical design, where critical discourse is being applied to producing products, services, or providing some universal application of design in order to change, address, to change, and evolve our society. So my end point is, well, contemporary art endures dual nature. It has three absolutely strong points: critical discursive practices, global distribution, and potential critical assessment of future models that turn it in potentially the most sophisticated tool of strategic communications that we ever had.
Thank you so much, Andris. And now it's over to you, Sam, for the altogether more serious business of laughter.
Let me see if this works. Oh, good. I've been wondering since I was first invited what role I was to play in this program for the last 2 days. Sitting here with distinguished academics, professors, PhDs, people who have analyzed communications, and I realized that I'm sort of on the front lines. Certainly not in the area of high art, but low art, in which we communicate directly with people, and perhaps in a way that is counter to any authoritative, for lack of a better word, propaganda. But I realize that there may be a good number of people here who have no idea who I am or what I do. So I'm going to give a short introduction to the magazine I work for, which is called Mad Magazine. According to one of my colleagues, Mad is the best-selling humor magazine in the world that goes by the name Mad. I have been the art director of Mad for the last 18 and a half years, and for 18 years before that, I was a contributor to Mad as an illustrator. Mad goes back 65 years and began its life, there we go, in 1952 as a comic book. And the intent was to make fun of other comic books. And eventually, it spread its focus a little wider, and in 3 years, became a magazine, somewhat modeled after Life magazine in that it was a mixture of words and pictures. And over the next decade, Mad evolved into the guilty pleasure that has influenced and inspired several generations of American writers, illustrators, cartoonists, filmmakers, and performers, fronted by its ageless cover boy, Alfred E. Newman, and his mindless refrain, "What me worry?" And this is his first appearance on the cover of Mad in 1956, and he has been on the cover pretty much every issue since then for the last 61 years. Now, while Mad's primary audience was presumed to be adolescents on the cusp of maturity, the writers, artists, and editors never patronized its readers. The focus was generally popular culture, movies, television shows, advertising. But behind its parodies of these things lurked a subversive message. Do not blindly trust what you are told by those in authority, whether they are your parents, your teachers, or the President of the United States. The ultimate message was, think for yourself. Now, to that end, politics and the social order have never been strangers to Mad, while not necessarily its primary focus. As early as 1954, when it was still a comic book, Mad took on the U.S. Senate hearings into un-American activities. Now, this is just a page from a 7-page comic strip. And what I like about this is it's what unites all of us. All of us have shown comic strips, whether it was the column of Trajan, the sacrifice, what was it, of and this is just a modern version of how to tell a story in pictures. Now, of course, Mad's take on the Un-American Activities Committee was that the hearings were simply boring and would be better off if they'd been presented as a game show, which was sort of predictive of what is going on in American politics today. Now, after that, politics and government were fair game for Mad. While there was always room to make fun of movies and TV, the concern for the state of world affairs was never ignored. Even one of Mad's most accessible regular features, Spy versus Spy, was not simply the wordless slugfest that it seemed at first glance. Spy versus Spy was created by Antonio Prohias, a noted editorial cartoonist from Havana who fled Cuba when Castro came to power. Spy versus Spy was literally a graphic black and white dissection of the futility of the Cold War, albeit one that was funny, entertaining, and brilliantly drawn. And over 50 years later, it is still a feature of the magazine, now written and drawn by Peter Cooper. The futility of war never ends. Now, I should point out that, like many, if not most Americans, the focus of Mad tends to be very domestic. We don't spend a lot of time dissecting international politics, but we focus quite a bit on our own home ground, particularly the presidency. And no U.S. president, from Dwight D. Eisenhower to the current resident of the White House, has gone unscathed in the pages of Mad. Here's an example. Now, of course, the satire would be sharper and more biting during periods of stress than when things got calmer. The war in Vietnam in the 1960s, the Watergate scandal in the 1970s found the magazine increasing its attention to matters of state. George W. Bush's military engagement in Iraq, among other things, made him a regular presence in the pages of Mad, including Mad's annual roundup of the 20 dumbest people, events, and things of the year. Bill Clinton did not escape Mad's satiric attention, although we didn't, like most commentators, focus so much on his political activities as his other activities. And neither did Barack Obama escape Mad's attention. Now, like many observers, Mad was somewhat unprepared for the turn of events that took place in last year's presidential elections. We sort of expected that Hillary Clinton was likely to take office. When that did not happen, we found ourselves, almost against our wills, fascinated by the unorthodox approach to governance practiced by the man who did win the presidency, Donald Trump. Now, while every single president of the last 65 years, with the odd exception of Gerald R. Ford, has appeared on the cover of Mad at least once, Mr. Trump has graced our covers not once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times in the last 2 years, less than 2 years. And that's a pretty impressive feat when you consider that Mad only comes out 6 times a year. We have found many ways to depict our president as a renovated architect of the new Mount Rushmore, for instance, or as the subject of a children's book. And since we truly believe that he is a chief executive for the ages, our next issue will present a portfolio of famous paintings recreated in his honor, such as this one. And of course, and this is interesting given the context of the entire discussion, he will once again be featured on our cover. Thank you.